All right, hi everybody. I know you guys aren't really excited about this type of training, nor am I, but uh, this will help get us through while we're all kind of on lockdown. And so we wanted to revisit our confined space uh, classroom programs that we've all taken, either NIPSA or IFSI or wherever else we took it, just to remember all of uh, the classroom stuff, all of that knowledge based information that we really ought to know, but sometimes gets lost just through training. And it's been, for some of us, been 10 years since we've been in class. So uh, we just put this together, take us through some of the refresher information that we ought to have. Hopefully, all of you have the the note taking guide that we included in the training. So as we go through, I'm checking my notes to kind of know where I should stop, so that you guys can write in the right information as we go through. We understand that it's really pretty easy for people to, one guy writes it down, photocopies it, and gives it to everybody else. We really hope that you don't do that, that you are working to make yourself better, and you do this somewhat seriously. I get it, I know, but hopefully we can learn something or can remember something. All right, so let's see if I can get this thing to advance. So the need for the training. The statistic from NIOSH is that 60 to 80% of all fatalities in multiple death incidents are what we consider to be would-be rescuers. The picture that you see on your screen is actually from an incident several years ago in Key Largo, Florida. So the way this story plays out is there were contractors who were looking for the source of a leak. And they'd shown up and they were looking around and they were trying to find it. And they decided that they were going to continue to investigate by looking in the sewer. So they popped the manhole. One guy climbed down and they didn't hear from him. So the second guy climbed down and they didn't hear from him. So the third guy climbed down, didn't hear from him. Fourth guy got a little bit smart and said, "I'm not going in there," and called 911. So fire department shows up, and of course, what do we do? Um, Firefighter climbs down into the space, and they don't hear from him. So we literally have bodies stacked on top of each other, and all four really should have known better, but it is what it is. The three contractors died from their injuries. The firemen spent a week in ICU, and I think what they found was methane and hydrogen sulfide were the causes. So there's nothing worse than just seeing firemen standing around not doing anything, and I get that. But we need to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. That being said, we're heading into duckling season. I don't know what it is in the last couple of springs, but with the popularity of social media really going nuts, every department in uh, in the U.S. is putting pictures of themselves on Facebook, on Instagram, saving ducklings. We've had them in Park Ridge, and then the pictures of this. I think we would all easily say, yeah, that's a confined space. And here's us putting pictures of ourselves um, breaking the law for ducklings. A real easy solution for this would be, how about a fishing net? And just fish them out with a fishing net. I know one that happened very close to me. They actually popped two manholes and put a fairly newer guy down on the other one to kind of chase ducklings back. And the strange part was is that they had trained people on duty who they could have called out, but they knew it would have taken longer than 15 minutes. So they just wanted to hurry up and get it done. I think we can all agree, pretty much unacceptable to get somebody injured for a duckling. All right. So the need for confined space training, confined space rescue. If we look at the fatalities, 47% are due to bad air, meaning lack of oxygen, gases, vapors, etc. Why do you think it is that oxygen is the number one thing that gets us? Well, it's because we can't see it. There's no sign telling me that, hey, it's bad, it's going to come get me. I probably can't smell it. I probably can't taste it. So air tends to be the number one thing that gets us. All right. Second one would be drowning, then toxic substances. 10% blunt force trauma, probably something getting dropped on me, or me falling off of something, or maybe I'm trying to pry open something and the handle slips and whacks me in the head. 2% electrocution, and then the last one being burns. None of those are really great ways to go out. Another big issue for us is going to be lockout tagout. Now, I don't know why this is still a thing and why we still have to talk about telling people to turn that off before you stick your head in there, or disconnect the power. But it's still a thing. So lockout tagout still very much important. I can show you pictures and pictures and pictures of people either trapped and dead, trapped and still alive, kind of like this guy. Just all the reasons why lockout tagout is so important. All right. This is a video that I show in a lot of my classes, and you have a guy using a torch. Looks like they got a lot of things going for them. They've got spotters who are up top. They're probably bosses or management of some type. You've got a forward guy who's sitting right on the edge. He finishes his work, kind of stands up, flips open the shield to take a look at what he's done, and something ignites those fumes. What you saw go flying was not his head, it was just the shield. But if we look at this one and we talk about what went right and what went wrong, there's lots of good things that are going on here. You've got spotters, you've got people with communication, you've got a forward guy who is kind of sitting and watching the worker in there. So doing some good stuff. You can see he's got, it looks like a self-retracting lifeline or something with a harness that keeps track of him. But some bad stuff, obviously. There's no ventilation. It doesn't look like there's any type of atmospheric testing. And I'm sure a lot of us would overlook this just because he's outside. So we wouldn't even think this is an issue. You notice as soon as everything goes kaboom, that forward guy kind of jumps in to help his buddy. Now, the assumption would be that everything's okay. And, any of the flammable gases that are there are gone. But he doesn't know that. I don't know that. None of us know that. So he might be putting himself into a bad spot too right now. Also, what would it cost us to ventilate that area? Just to take a blower fan and kind of put, over here, put the blower fan and then run the ductwork down in here just to blow those fumes out of here, or put it back here and run it so that it's being pushed away from him. It really wouldn't cost us a whole lot to do that. All right. So, definitions of a confined space. All right, so OSHA has a three-pronged component for their definition of a confined space. All right, first one is that it has a restricted entry or exit. So restricted doesn't mean one way in and one way out. If that was the case, every bathroom would be a confined space. There's nothing restricted about walking in and out of a door. Now, if I were to take and board off that door and I have to crawl in and crawl out, now it's restricted. OSHA even differentiates between walking down a flight of stairs versus climbing down a ladder. So if I have to climb down a ladder to get into a pit, now that's restricted. Walking downstairs, not restricted. All right. Second component is that it has to be big enough for me to get in and actually do something. So a mailbox, for example, can't be a confined space because it's not big enough for me to get in and actually do something. The last one on there is not meant for continuous human occupancy. All right. So if I'm looking at confined spaces in my town, in my still district, I'm using these three things to determine, is it a confined space or not? All right. And if it meets all three, then yeah, it would be a confined space as defined by OSHA, by ANSI, by NFPA. All right. Now we have to determine, is it permit required or not? So in order for it to be permit required, it has to meet all three of those definitions plus any one of these four. Number one, it meets the definition and it has a bad atmosphere or has the potential to have a bad atmosphere. Number two, it has a bad configuration. So OSHA specifically calls out inwardly converging floors or walls, so like the bottom of a grain silo, but anything that could get me caught or stuck would make it permit required. There's an engulfment hazard of some type, so that could be liquid or sludge, it could be grain or soil, anything like that. And the fourth one, OSHA really likes their catch-alls. They like to have a catch-all in place. Any other known hazard. All right. So I'm armed now with these three components of the definition of a confined space. If it meets that, then I need to determine, does it require a permit or not? And all it has to do is meet any one of those four. All right. So here's OSHA's definition. 1910-146 comes from the industry standard. They have a construction standard now, and it basically says the exact same thing. It's just in 1926-1200. So nothing groundbreaking there. ANSI standard is basically the same definition. It just they just kind of reword it. Some municipalities, some jurisdictions in North America, they add in a component for it to be a permit required space. Is that if medical attention or if emergency response is delayed due to the space. So think about a space. If I'm at home or I'm at the firehouse and I twist and injure my knee, it's really pretty easy for someone to call the ambulance crew. They come over, they put me onto the cot, back of the rig, off I go to the hospital. That same injury inside of a sewer, and I can't climb myself out of there, it makes it a big deal. So now all of a sudden it's become a confined space rescue when really I just need help, but because the space has turned that into a greater hazard for me. All right. So other legislation or other rules that we might need to follow. OSHA 1926 talks about fall protection. So making sure that I don't fall into the space versus falling off of something. Gravity doesn't care if I'm falling into it or off of it. So making sure that our attendants are tied off, people working on or near the hole are tied off. 1926-1200 is the confined space standard for construction. 1910 is the fall protection standard for general industry. Other ones we have to worry about, the respiratory programs, lockout, tagout, hazardous communication. If we look at NFPA 350 talks about confined spaces. NFPA 350 specifically calls out fall protection for attendants, for people who are near the holes, so where they could fall in. And it's weird about holes. You have a 3x3 hole, and that's a 20-foot deep hole, and nobody really thinks much of it. I go and put you 20 feet in the air near an unprotected edge with no guardrail or anything, and you act a little bit differently. You kind of edge up to it. But for some reason, when it's a hatch or a hole, we kind of ignore that problem. 1670 is operations and training of TRT incidents, and then NFPA 1001 TRT personnel professional qualifications. Okay, so non-permanent spaces, some examples: utility vaults, below-grade trenches, storage vaults, utility sub-basements. We see these all over the place. Some examples of permit-required spaces: chemical storage tanks, storage pits, boilers, underground tunnels, etc. All of these contractors that we see going in the confined spaces, or companies in your towns, they should have a written confined space management program. Like any employee who works there should have the ability to go over and say, "Hey, can I see the confined space program?" Open it up and be able to read what are the rules, what are the policies, what are the SOPs, etc. Likewise, those are our SOPs. That's our program. So we have the same thing. Now the question is always, how does OSHA apply to me? How does OSHA apply to the fire department? Well, if you think about it, we're at work. When we train, we're at work. It's not part of an emergency response scenario. So for us to solely say, hey, NFPA is the one that I have to follow, I'm at work. We fall under OSHA. Now in Illinois, because we're municipalities, IDOL is who enforces it, but they're just enforcing what OSHA says. All right. So kind of the next level down from that is our SOPs. So you have kind of general, and then you get more specific as we work our way down. All right. So what is the definition of entry? Well, most of us, if we remember anything from confined space class, we know that it's the breaking of the plane. So breaking of the plane into the space with any part of my body. So the question is, am I allowed to break the plane into a confined space? The answer is yes. I absolutely can. But what am I now? I'm not an attendant. I'm no longer the entry supervisor. I've now become an entrant. So now on my permit, I need to be documented as such. All right. So there's nothing that says that I can't make entry. Just if I'm going to make entry, even by putting my hand in there, I have to be documented as an entrant. All right. Just check and make sure that I'm giving you guys all the info that you guys need for your note sheet. All right. So some potential hazards, we could have engulfment, oxygen deficiency, oxygen enrichment, flammable gases, vapors, toxic substances, IDLH atmospheres, and then physical hazards, slips, trips, and falls. I hit my head on something. It's full of snakes or scorpions or spiders or something like that. All right. This term IDLH, we see this, we talk about it, meaning immediately dangerous to life and health. All right. This doesn't mean that I touch it and I die. All right, it's not like some of the facilities, institutions we've gone to take classes, and oh, you're dead. You touched that. It doesn't always mean that. It could mean that I die later. It could, later today, tomorrow. So you think about that idea of IDLH, and we're going to treat a space as being an IDLH hazard until proven otherwise. So when we're assessing the space, just don't assume that it's okay. I realize the ducklings are all right, but how much oxygen does a duckling use versus how much do you use? So assume that it's an IDLH atmosphere until proven otherwise. All right. So some of the hazards that we might run into, that we might deal with, explosions, fumes, machinery. When I see that picture, I think about the confined space incident they had out in Algonquin, where out there at the Raging Buffalo, the snowboard park, where the guy got caught in one of the vaults underneath the magic carpet. He got his arm stuck into it, and they needed mechanics to actually help take it apart. Then you have entrapment hazards, noise. Noise isn't one that you think about readily, but it's really going to hamper our communications. It's going to hamper our the way we think, and how we're able to work in there. And none of us want to be walking around at 50 with $6,000 hearing aids on our ears. Biologic hazards, standard work hazards, electricity, heat. It's one that we don't think of as much. You have young guys who might have gone out and tied one on the night before and come in dehydrated. You have some of the older guys who are getting outworked by the younger guys, and we drank too much coffee, and we're trying to keep up with them. So if heat is an issue, make sure that we're rotating guys a lot faster and a lot earlier. Also, it might be that you're one of the younger team members and you're getting outworked by an old guy. So you're trying to keep going. So make sure we stay hydrated. We rotate people out more often. Last one on there, slips, trips, and falls. And then the bottom one, we have weather stuff. Those first two, sometimes that's not stuff that we can control. If I'm in a storm sewer, it's really kind of impossible for me to fully lock out and tag out that storm sewer. Out in California, they actually have diverting valves that they can divert the water to go a different direction, so they actually can pull it off. But with us, we can't do that. So make sure that we're paying attention to what the weather's doing. Drowning or engulfment hazards, radioactive stuff, and then sludge, cave-ins, etc. All right. So watch this video and see if you can tell me what you think about it.
I wouldn't want to be in that vault right now. You kidding me?
I know.
Couldn't pay me enough to do that, Joel.
And you guys wonder why we checked the fucking torque. That didn't sound good. That's why we check torque on bolts, guys. Jesus.
Yeah, Joel, maybe you should step out for a minute.
Until that thing settles in. Yeah, get out.
All right, guys. Sorry that the video was clipping so bad. I think it's the recording for this video plus that the Mac is 6 years old, so it might be having a hard time. So if you watch this video, there's a lot of stuff going on here that it's in bad shape. First of all, you can hear them talking about it, saying, "Oh, you couldn't pay me enough to be in there." There's one part where the camera pans up to an attendant who's standing there, and he looks right at the camera and goes, he knows something's wrong, but they all know, but they're not going to say anything. They're not going to stop it for some crazy reason. Because nobody wants to be that guy. They don't want to be the one who say, "Hey, this isn't safe. Let's not do this." They'd be the nervous Nelly. So they just let it keep going, and then what ends up happening is that guy kind of gets blown out of that hole. At the very end of the video, you actually see the attendant or the entrant kind of walking away, but looks really, really bad. Couple of things to notice is that if you looked at the chain for the tripod, no tension in that chain whatsoever. So if they went to pull him up out of that space, there's a chance that those legs may try to splay out because that's the reason why that chain is there. It looked like he had a harness on, but it wasn't connected to anything. So in order to get him out of there, we'd have to go in after him. So if I were to ask you, "Hey, you're going to go into that hole before that steam rupture," you would probably go, "Yeah, no problem." But there's actually a spot in the picture where it is just steam blowing out of that hole. Well, if I asked you at that point, "Hey, who wants to go in?" Nobody wants to go in at that point. So you look at this and you think, man, all those things that are going wrong here. Yeah, hopefully that gets avoided well before they're calling us and we have to deal with it. But most likely, if we're there, it's something like that that's going on. All right. So hazard assessment. So if I look at hazard assessment, the first thing that we're always going to check for when we look at the atmosphere is going to be oxygen for a couple reasons. Number one, we kind of need it. Number two is that our gas meters need a certain amount of oxygen in the air for the reading to be accurate. So we kind of want to know what that number is. So years ago when we had 4 individual, 5 individual meters, this one checks oxygen, we would just check that one first. Well, now with the technology we have, the 4-gas meter just checks it simultaneously. All right. So if I look at for appropriate values in the air, 20.8 or 20.9 is what we breathe normally. We are designed to breathe dirty air. All right. 78% of what we breathe is nitrogen. So we breathe it in, we breathe it right back out. And then there's like another percent of a bunch of other stuff that we just kind of breathe in and breathe out. All right. So at 19.5, so the good range is 19.5 to 23.5. If it's 19.4 or less, it's considered oxygen deficient. Now, 19.4, I don't fall over dead. It means I'm going to start breathing a little bit harder. As it starts dropping, I'm have an impaired attention span, which I already have. I'm not making good decisions. Some of us are making bad decisions anyhow, so I don't know how you tell the difference. But then as it goes lower and lower and lower, finally, I would go unconscious. But there would be other symptoms that would be in there first. 23.5 is the upper limit. So anything 23.6 and above would be considered oxygen enriched. Obviously, the reason why that would be bad for us is that, well, fire really, really likes oxygen. So what we're looking for is oxygen that's 20.9. If it's not 20.9, my question is, why isn't it? What else is in there that could be causing me a problem? All right. So 1% of change could mean 10,000 parts per million of some other gas. So let's fix it, ventilate it, and move on. All right. So the second thing we look at is going to be the LEL, or the flammability. So we look at our LEL and the UEL. The LEL, the lower explosive limit, or the LFL, the lower flammable limit. And our 4-gas meters are going to start to alarm at 10% of the LEL. So if I look over here, right here is where our meter is going to start to alarm. All right. Now, if your meters are set to alarm at 5 and 10, all right, it'll start at 5% of the LEL. So this chart is looking at methane. Has an LEL of 5% and a UEL of 15%. Here it's too rich, here it's too lean. Our meter is going to alarm down here. Now, that's because my meter has been calibrated to methane. Well, if it's got a different, if the gas that's in the space is different or has a different LEL or different flammable range, it's not going to be 100% accurate. So if we're looking at, say, propane, so propane has an LEL of 2.1. So we're going to say right here is where we're at the LEL for propane. Well, now I don't have 90% more to go. I have, I don't know, I'm almost a third of the way there already. So if it's alarming, if it's showing us that there's an LEL in there, we're going to ventilate it and get rid of it and hopefully find the cause of it or the source, because we're all flammable. Okay. So some definitions that we need to understand. Percentage. So if we're talking about percent, you have to know the total amount in order to use the term percentage. All right. If there's 5 of us that are in the room and I say 20% of us have red hair, all right, well, that means 1 out of 5 has red hair. I have to know the total amount. It's like when people say they have a hearing loss and they say they have a 20% hearing loss. Like a 20% of what? That's on how you measure hearing. You measure it in decibels. So we tend to use percentages because we understand them, we think. So make sure that if it's measured in percentage, that's what we're using. The LEL and the UEL, we talked about just a minute ago. Parts per million. Now, parts per million, easiest way to explain parts per million is if I were to take this room and fill it up with 1,000,000 white ping pong balls. All right, I take one and I paint it red. Now I have 1 part per million. All right, 1% of 1,000,000 is 10,000 parts. So think about that for a second. If I've got a change on my 4-gas meter of 1% of oxygen, so there's some other gas that's displacing the oxygen, pushing it out of the way, there could be 10,000 parts per million of ethyl, methyl, bad stuff number 2 that may not affect me right now, but gives me cancer 10 years down the road. All right. Time weighted average, how long I can work in something, 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week. And then your short-term exposure limit, how long I can work in an environment for 15 minutes, 4 times a day with a 1-hour break in between. So 15 minutes, 1-hour break. 15 minutes, 1-hour break. All right. Where we're going to get this information and know what our time-weighted average is, to know what the STEL is, to know what my ceilings are, to know where it's IDLH, know where it's the flammable limits, etc., are going to be in the SDS of the chemical. The companies in your still district should be using the GHS system, the Global Harmonized system. It's actually any country that's part of the UN has adopted this, so that SDS or safety data sheets are now standardized. So it should look the same. What used to happen is it was kind of dependent upon manufacturer to manufacturer, what was on there, how it was organized, etc. So now they've just kind of given a better organization to the SDS. All right. This is going to be our roadmap. This is going to be how we're going to know what the hazards are. If you show up and you ask them for the safety data sheets and they look at you cross-eyed, like, what are you talking about? That kind of should raise your antenna and tell you, all right, this is going to be a bigger deal because they don't even know what an SDS is. All right. So the next chemical we want to look at is going to be carbon monoxide. We go on these calls all the time. Your time-weighted average is 35 parts per million. But if you look at somebody else, like I think NIOSH is 25 parts per million. So depending on where you're working, where you are, OSHA's 50 parts per million. Again, if it's there, we're going to ventilate it. We don't want to breathe it. It's bad. It'll give us a headache and eventually make us nauseated. The weight of carbon monoxide is 0.967. So remember, when we look at vapor density, we're looking at the weight of the gas. So we take air and we give it a value of 1. So like helium is 0.5. It's much lighter than air, so it's up there. Carbon monoxide is 0.96, so it's slightly lighter than air, so we're going to expect it to be up a little bit, but it pretty much could be just about anywhere. All right. Carbon dioxide comes from us. That's what we breathe out. So we go on CO calls. We do not go on CO2 calls, at least not typically. We don't use a CO extinguisher. We have a CO2 extinguisher. This comes from us, and it's on the good-bad scale, it's bad. So the space that we're in, we could be poisoning ourselves just by being in there. All right. Hydrogen sulfide. This is sewer gas. Smells like rotten eggs. Hydrogen sulfide comes from breaking down of organic materials. Colorless, odorless, except for that smell that you will get kind of initially, but then goes away pretty quickly. So we don't ever want to trust our 5 senses with detecting if that gas is there or not. There's a video from a long time ago of a train derailment, and you see a boss. You can tell he's a boss because he's wearing a white shirt, and there's product offloading of this tanker car, and he like sticks his hand in there and tastes it. I know we all watch Miami Vice as kids, and Sonny Crockett always tastes the cocaine. So yeah, don't trust our 5 senses. Make sure we're using some kind of a meter or something. Time-weighted average is 10 parts per million. The Stell is 15 parts per million. Remember, 15 red ping pong balls is how long I can work in that environment for 15 minutes. All right. Ammonia, toxic, lighter than air. Yeah, this is bad. It'll destroy your bunker gear if you try to wear that in there. All right. So your permits. We developed this permit last year. We wanted something that was kind of quick and easy and kind of dirty, that a squad boss at a space could fill out. Excuse me, while they're working, while companies are working. There are some great resources that are out there. I mean, where it's 20, 30 pages. Confined space permits with different sections and different. You give whoever the air boss is, they get this packet, and you get that packet. There's some great stuff that's out there. We just wanted something that was kind of easy and quick and dirty, that would help us to meet OSHA standards, OSHA requirements, and yet allow us to get some work done. On the left-hand side, those are kind of information that has to be there. OSHA has, they list out, here's what you've got to have on your permit. So date, location, description of the space, how many victims, what was the last time that they were seen, what strategy are we in, rescue, recovery, or are we just not doing anything at all? What your atmospheric testing say, notice that the air monitor brand and type of monitor, and then signing off saying, here, I'm the one who did it. We need to be documenting our results every 15 minutes. That doesn't mean that we only check it every 15 minutes. That just means that we're going to test it or I'm sorry, going to actually document it every 15 minutes. Now, eventually, we may have a hazmat response there, so we may be handing off that meter to a hazmat team member. I would personally, I would much rather have a hazmat team member who is really in tune with what this thing can and can't do. I'd really rather have that information come to me versus one of us who, things start flashing and we start hitting buttons and messing it up sometimes. So eventually we might be handing this off to somebody else. The other thing is that I really like working on a 2 meter system, one up top with a pump with a hose, or one outside the space with the hose maybe attached to like a broom handle or something that we can stick in there and monitor, and then a second meter on the entry teams. And if both meters are saying the same thing, we can be pretty confident in their results. If they're way off, it might be that there's a problem with one of them, or it could simply be that the entry team is working in an area that that meter, the one up top, can't sample. So, marking that information down so that we're keeping track as we go through. You also have other hazard types: electrical, mechanical, hydraulic, and then any other respiratory, fall hazards, anything else, spiders, snakes, whatever. The other page is, what kind of hazard controller we're using. Lockout, tagout, ventilation. Notice on the ventilation, we're talking about the size of the space. So we're going to ask you to do a little bit of math. Length times width times height. That'll give you the cubic feet. And then what the CFM is of the fan. We'll talk about that one in a little bit. And then actually doing the math to figure out what the total air exchanges per hour are. All right. Down on the entry log, who's going in, what time did they go in, if they're on SCBA, what's your pressure in, pressure out. We need to make sure that we have names. I would also probably, underneath the entry team, have their unit number. All right, squad 1, squad 2, we call them recon, etc. So your written permit, permitted space program, what are our entry conditions going to be? How are we going to test? How are we going to isolate? How are we going to ventilate the space? How are we going to communicate with one another? Lighting, barriers, lockout, tagout. All of these things are included in a standard confined space entry program. All right. Now, for us, we've talked a lot about these resource guides for first incident commanders, battalions in the division, even company officers. So if they roll up to a technical rescue incident and they're not sure what to do, this is kind of our playbook. So what we would like for them to get done before we get there. All right, so you can see each one of those blocks is numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. Number 1 is size up. Number 2 is what's the response. So ensuring that we actually ask for a box alarm for the team to show up. Making sure that, especially for like confined space, to make sure that Air 3 is moving from NIPSTA if it's a weekend or if it's after hours, ensuring that it's going to be on its way. That's got the majority of our supplied air system. 3, how to secure the scene. And then number 4, kind of what are your objectives? What are we asking you to get done before the team arrives? Now, some places will say, hey, Dave, we don't have any confined space equipment. But my guess is that you have a 4-gas meter, you have a PPV. So if ventilation is an issue, especially the new battery-powered the blowhard fans, we can angle it down and start ventilating, or angle it in and start ventilating the space. You have ladders, so we can use those. You guys can be setting up hot, warm, and cold zones, and then lighting. You've got all those things that really make it a lot easier. This is the kind of conversations you ought to be having with your first in companies, so they feel comfortable with it, and that they're okay with asking for the team to come in. You'll notice the bottom of that form, it kind of explains that we're coming in to help you, and that we'll give the incident commander somebody to kind of help them through as the incident progresses. All right. So your equipment. We mentioned the 4-gas meters. On Rescue 3, we have Draeger 4-gas meters, and then we have an MSA Altair. Those are the ones that we've been issued. We bought the Altair a few years ago. There's two forms of maintenance or whatever that needs to be done to the 4-gas meters. There's calibration and then there's bump testing. All right. So the I just realized I missed one of my questions for you guys. Now I'll talk about it in a minute. Calibration and bump testing. Calibration is making sure that it will read it accurately. So typically that calibration gets done either every 30, 60, 90 days, whatever the manufacturer tells us to do. The bump test is where we spray a little bit of gas on it, or not gasoline, but for testing cal gas or something, we kind of blow on it, or we can inject into it, and it'll start to alarm and show us that it can read gas. OSHA wants us to do that bump test before any entry. All right. The problem is that for us in a rescue scenario, we don't have that ability to go, hold on, Bob, we got to do this thing with the meter before we can get in there. If they already have meters that are working, and we can ask them, have they been calibrated? Have they been bump tested? And that, yeah, it's on our permit. We're good. We can trust their meters. I would want to back it up, trust but verify. But we can be using our meters to put them to work also. When the hazmat team, if they arrive, or one of our team members that's also kind of dual trained in hazmat, Kevin Maslin, Doug Lindstrom, I'm sure I'm missing others that are Mikey Isom, they show up, we can say, hey, can we get the other meters? Can we switch them out after they've been bump tested? And then we can get that type of, we can keep the operation going. But we're not going to stop and not do anything, while we're waiting for a bump test. That's just, it's just not feasible. The hazmat team has more meters, and they also have what's called an area array. So it's a larger meter that they can actually put on a tripod, and they can actually shoot it at the area. So they can actually measure what kind of air and particles and whatever are coming out of that space. So we're testing in the space. You think about an incident. Where's everyone want to be? Well, they're going to go right to the hole. And everybody's got to go and look over and go, oh, look, it's a sewer. It's what everybody does naturally. Well, we don't know what's coming out of that space. So if we have the hazmat team there, we get that opportunity. We can actually measure and see what's coming back out of there. Is it hazardous to us? Do our attendants need to be in some type of PPE? All right. The last thing for meters is make sure that we know, or that we're using the meter the way it's designed to be used. So both of those meters that are on the screen, neither one of those have a pump on it. So if I'm trying to test the space, what you'll see people do sometimes is they'll take a rope and they attach to the meter and they go dropping the meter into the space. A couple problems with it. If it starts to alarm, you pull it back up to see what it said. By the time you pull it back up, it's not going to say that number anymore. All right? So you don't know how or why it alarmed. Maybe you're savvy enough and you know to check the peaks. But my question, did you clear the peaks before you put it in, or are you just hoping that that's what it's related to? We don't really know. Likewise, you could lower it in, and remember, there's set limits where it'll start to alarm. Well, if it's at 9% of the LEL, it's not going to alarm. So you're at 9, but you don't know that because you don't have the right tool for the job. So using the one with tubing that has a pump so that we can adequately measure the space, that's the way to go. Only other thing with that tubing is, remember, you have to wait for that pump to draw the air up and into the meter and give it a second to think about it before you move on, or before you take that reading. All right. When we go to do that testing, we're going to test top, middle, bottom of the space. We just talked a little bit ago about some of the gases being lighter than air, heavier than air. Hydrogen sulfide has a vapor density of 1.2. So it's heavier than air, so it's going to be at the bottom, versus I think ammonia, which is like 0.5, so it's going to be up high. All right. So with these issues, ventilation is going to be one of the best things that we can do. two types of ventilation that are out there: natural ventilation and then forced air ventilation. All right. Natural ventilation is opening up a window. Now, really nice, but not always um, reliable. So most of the time, we're going to go to a forced air ventilation system. All right. So that top picture, we're blowing fresh air in, we blow the bad stuff out, we're good. All right. Another type of system might be an exhaust system, not as popular, not as widely used, but I guess it could work, where we're drawing the bad air out, drawing fresh air in. The Cadillac of systems is really kind of a push-pull. So you're pushing fresh air in, you're drawing bad air out. The picture that you see is, you have a worker in there who's doing hot work. So the exhaust isn't really just drawing out random air. It might even be a local exhaust, so it's sitting right next to where he or she is working, pulling out the bad stuff out of the space. They also might use like a purge gas. So we don't do this, but we might be showing up in an incident where they have used a purge gas, like an argon, like a nitrogen or something, where they're going to push all the air out so the environment is less flammable. So that worker who's in there welding would be on, a supplied air system or on like an SCBA. All right. When they're done, what they would do is they would repurge it with fresh air, close it out, and be done. Now, there are some problems with ventilation, and sometimes it's just because, well, we tend to screw it up. All right, back up a couple pictures. So if you look at that top picture, you have that blower fan going in, and you notice the hose only goes in a little bit. So what ends up happening is that we circulate the air up here, but we don't really circulate any of the air down here. So we kind of want that hose to be sitting a foot or two off of the floor or a foot or two off of a wall. What that allows me to do is it kind of gives a spot for that air to push and kind of push everything up and out. Another thing that happens is if I take this blower and instead of setting it off to the side this way, I go and I put it over here. Well, now what happens is I push fresh air in, fresh air pushes the bad stuff out, bad stuff comes out, gets sucked up by the fan, gets pushed right back in. Same thing happens with having squads or engines or towers or sitting there and they're running the whole time, and we could be filling up that space with bad air. All right. Same thing happens with the duct work, the kinks that happen. We've got to be diligent about keeping everything nice and smooth. All right. So when we look at ventilation, we are looking at ventilating the space, and I've asked you to figure out what the size of the space is. So length times width times height gets you the cubic feet. And then we want to put in what's the CFM of the fan. So on the side of the blower fan, it's going to show us what's the capability of that fan. So you'll see right here, free air, meaning it's just pushing straight through. There's nothing, no bends, no tubing. We're at 890 CFM. If I put the tubing on and I have one bend, drops me down to 825. All right, and you can see it drops off significantly after that. So our scenario is I've got a space that's 10 by 10 by 10, all right, 1,000 cubic feet. So the formula is my air exchanges per hour is equal to the CFM of the fan times 60, because remember we're talking per hour, divided by length times width times height. So 825 times 60 is 49,500. 49,500 divided by 1,000, I have 49 and a half air exchanges per hour. So how long would it take for this space, for this fan, to complete one revolution of air? Well, realistically, it should be done in a little bit over a minute. Okay? But if you've ever taken a space and filled it up with like theatrical smoke or something, we did this last summer in Park Ridge, where we completely charged the space with theater smoke and then tried to ventilate it. Based on the capacity of the fan and the space, it really should have cleared it out in about a minute and a half, and it took closer to 4 or 5 minutes, just because you have all of the little holes and corners and stuff where the bad air can hang out. So we're trying to get as many air exchanges as possible. So here's a question for you. If I have bad air in the space, and I put a blower fan in there. So it's got bad in there, air in there. We know that it is now a permit required space because there's bad air. If I put the blower fan in and I blow out all the bad air, is it still a permit required space? The answer is yes, it is. OSHA specifically calls that out and says, yeah, no, it's still a permit required space. All right. Now, if you were able to block out the sources that would cause it to be to have bad air, well, now we could declassify it or reclassify it as a non-permitted space. But that's not something that we're typically doing in a rescue scenario. That kind of gets done by the host or by the company. All right. So preparing for entry, site isolation, making sure that nobody can get to the space, isolating off the area from electricity, from fluids, hazards, etc. Lockout, tagout, making sure that we're locking that out. For us, it's most likely going to be the incident commander who is going to be locking out and keeping control of that key for all of the rescue teams. All right. So equipment selection. Sorry, the little window is covering up the title. But thinking about what equipment are we going to need to get this done, depending on the scenario, it could require lots of different stuff. Additionally, PPE for us, SCBAs versus a supplied air respirator. Pros and cons of an SCBA. SCBA, it's really quick. It's mobile. We're really familiar with it. We know how to use it. A con would be, think about what happens to my profile when I put on an SCBA. It's a lot harder to fit into a tight spot. We have limited air, so I have a definitive time that I have to get back out now. All right. It's also, maybe you could say it's heavy, depending on what your air pack is. If we look at supplied air regulators, or supplied air respirators, pros and cons. Pro, unlimited air. I can be in there forever. It gives me a much smaller profile, so it's easier to fit in tight spots. A con would be I got to drag that hose around, and I'm limited to how far I can go. I can only go 300 feet, maximum. Another con would be unlimited air. I could be in there for a really long time. So on supplied air, we have to be concerned about how long are the workers in there, how long are our teams in there, and be able to pull them out, even when they're not tired. Pulling you out before you're tired is a good thing. That way you can get out. If you're tired and exhausted and have to send somebody else in after you, that doesn't help anybody. So at the bottom, the important part there, make sure that we know that our supplied air systems, max length 300 feet. Yes, we have our escape bottles, but max is 300 feet. And then we need to flush those hoses before we use them. There was an incident where they actually, guys were using their supplied air system and they were feeling funny, so they decided to test it, and they were getting some weird readings on their floor gas meters. So get it hooked up, get it ready to go, and start flushing the air as soon as possible before we get guys going. All right. Other PPEs, other PPE that we might need: helmets, safety glasses, gloves, knee pads, safety toe boots, hearing protection, jumpsuits, bunker gear, maybe, depending on the type of environment that we're going into. All right. The second page on our permit, looking at hazard control, make sure that this is getting filled out. Lockout, tag out, other different types of PPE that we might be using. Level A hazmat level. I hope we're not going to a confined space with level A hazmat. That doesn't sound like a lot of fun. I don't want to do level B, let alone level A. But if we need to, we need to. Air purifying respirators. So an N95 is an APR. If you have like one of the canister systems, that's an APR. Your Millennium mask is an air APR. Ventilation, we talked about. Your rigging, starting to think about what your rigging is going to be. What's our route of entry? Top, side, bottom. What's our communication method going to be? The hardline comm systems they take a little bit of time to get set up, but once they're set up, they're really pretty nice. So our radios might not always work for us. So if we can get the con space system set up, even with the talk box, take that in with the entry team and leave it with the victim, or leave it where we're working, and that way we can communicate back and forth. All right, so getting ready to go in. You have your atmospheric testing, your SDS sheets, ventilation equipment, rescue plan. You've got plan A, you're working on plan A. What's plan B look like? If this doesn't work, what are we going to do then? Our rescue hierarchy, going in after somebody. This is a pretty standard hierarchy to use. Is it an assisted rescue where we just drop in a ladder? I think one of our towns, maybe not that far from me, they had to drop in a ladder into a sewer vault, and the worker climbed out. Pretty easy. Non-entry rescue, maybe we're using an interim system where we put the 4-to-1 on their tagline. Guys, that's the whole point of a tagline, is so that we can do a non-entry rescue and we can inchworm you out. Maybe the worker has a harness on but no tagline. We can use one of the rescue poles to hook them and get them out. Entry rescue is typically the one that we think of, but really should be at the bottom of our hierarchy. Hopefully we're going into a normal atmosphere where I may not need to use an SCBA or supplied air, ventilation, lockout, tagout, etc., or a bad atmosphere, or maybe an unknown atmosphere where we have to go to SCBAs or supplied air. To go in, this comes from OSHA. The employer shall give us a harness to wear. We want to have a harness to get me back out of there. Make sure that it's worn properly. Make sure that I have a tagline. The goal of the tagline is allow me to perform non-entry rescue. All right. So, or it could be to help find me, depending on where I'm going. All right. There are situations where we're allowed to get rid of the tagline, and it's basically if it causes a greater hazard, not if it's inconvenient. If it causes a greater hazard. So if you're losing your tagline, now or by losing I mean taking it off, we have to be able to justify that. So it's not something that we want to get in the habit of doing. We just don't go in with any taglines. There are going to be situations where maybe we can't because of the environment, but it should be the exception, not the rule. All right. So the entrant, the rescuer going in, needs to know what the hazards are. They have to be able to use the right PPE. They have to be able to maintain communication with attendants. When we talk about the maintaining communication, could be radio, could be hardline systems, it could be voice contact, whatever works. Might have to be hand signals if it's really noisy. Get out of the space if they get ordered by somebody. If they see there's something wrong, if there's a prohibited condition, like you see something, fire, etc., spiders, if some type of an alarm is activated, and then make sure you can let the attendants know, hey, there's a problem. The requirements of the attendant is to stay outside the space unless you are relieved by somebody else. So there's no requirement to have, how to say this, the 2 in 2 out rule has gotten kind of messed up somewhere throughout my career, where 2 in 2 out, 3 in 3 out, 4 in 4 out. That's not what it means. I don't have, if I have 10 2-man teams in there, we don't have to have 10 2-man attendants out here. That just doesn't make sense. But we have to have enough attendance or support for that attendant so that everything and all the jobs are getting completed, and everything is kind of taken care of. So know what the hazards are, stay outside, maintain communication, know what the prohibited conditions are, and then alert somebody, alert the workers to get out. Call for more help or whatever if needed. Perform no other duties that interfere with the attendant's primary duties. And this is probably the one that gets us into the most trouble. Or, like at drills and stuff, we're chatting with our buddies that we haven't seen since last month. Just make sure that we're staying focused and doing the job that we're supposed to. All right. The entry supervisor, probably going to be a squad boss, who is going to be, it's a go, no go, to be able to pull somebody out in the Here's the thing, guys. This stuff only works if the squad boss says, no, you're not going in, that you don't go in. If the squad boss says, stop, I'm switching you out, you're coming out, and none of us want to get pulled out. But what ends up happening is the entry supervisor, that squad boss, says, "Hey, we're switching you out. We've got another team coming in." No, 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 no. 5 more minutes, and I'll just, you know, I get it, but they pull you out. They got to pull you out. Um, this only works if we put the hierarchy in place. You got to listen to them. You just got to. All right. So I always very much appreciate guys throttling up, gonna work harder, but if they pull you out because something's unsafe, they're pulling you out, and there's no discussion about it. All right. So that entry supervisor has to be somebody who can step up and say yes or no. It's their name that's going on that permit. Uh, if one of the directors is there, they may sign off on that for you, but only if they kind of know what's going on. All right. So knowing what all the exposures, all the signs and symptoms are, verify that everything is set up, and verify requires something of the entry supervisor, the squad boss. That means check it. You should be trusting who's giving you that information. If you don't trust them, I wouldn't accept that as being good information. Terminate the permit when everything is done. Verify that rescue services are available for us. That's going to be make sure we have a backup for our guys. So we should have a team on deck ready to go that's going to be acting as kind of a RIT team. All right. Take appropriate measures to get anybody out of there that's not supposed to be in there, and then everything. Make sure that it stays consistent with what the permit is saying. So as far as rescue, employers are supposed to have readily available rescue. Not always the case, especially when they're trying to rely on us. This is kind of again the outline of what OSHA what NIOSH told us as far as the most common causes of fatalities. NFPA 1670 says that we need to be trained at least to the BLS level. In Division 3, we're going to have ALS companies who are there. If we need to provide medical care in the space, and I've got 2 non-medics in there, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So if we're talking about recon teams, if we're talking about entry teams, and we're talking where we have to be providing care in the space, squad bosses, you need to, hey, are you still a medic? I know we have lots of lieutenants who are on our team who I know go on ambulance calls, but maybe they haven't done any skills in a while. So let's make sure we choose wisely who we're sending in if we need to do care. All right. So 1910-146K is where they talk about rescue. This is the whole rescue section. Things that are highlighted in there, that employers have to be able to evaluate a prospective rescuer's ability to respond to a rescue summons in a timely manner. What's timely mean? Respiratory protection is required in the event of an IDLH atmosphere. They need to have a standby team. Most of the time they're thinking that that's us, and we all know that's probably not us. So the event of a rescue, you show up. Phase 1 is going to be your assessment of your scene, size up. Ask for their permit. If they look at you and say, hey, we don't need, we don't even know what a permit is, that should tell you that something's really quite wrong. Your size up, conditions, actions, and needs. What do I have? What am I doing? What do I need? Remember the needs part of it. I like the N being on there because it kind of forces me to think about maybe not what I need right this second, but what am I going to need? All right. Phase 2, pre-entry operations. Who do I have? Whoever's showing up, you're there and the team's starting to trickle in. If you're the first team member there, you are by default the TRT incident commander initially. Nobody else is there. So make sure you go up to whoever is incident command and say, hi, I'm here. What do you need from us? Who do we have so far? What equipment is here? Do you have a squad? Is it here? Because, hey, we have a squad, but it's sitting in the station because nobody brought it. Doesn't do us a whole lot of good. If you start seeing your A-team players show up, you have a good strategy. Versus if you have your D squad showing up, you might go, all right, I got to adjust what it is we're going to do. What's plan B? In the event that this goes wrong, what else are we going to do? Equipment selection. Am I going with the standard tripod? Am I using a vortex? Is there a structural anchor overhead? Am I using just a 4-to-1 block and tackle, or are we doing like with an MPD where we're going through a change of direction and then back to the MPD? Atmospheric testing, do we have multiple meters? Do we need SCBAs? Do we need supplied air? If we're looking at rigging, our belays, man, if I've got a tripod and I can hang um, a Petzl ASAP, upside down, you walk up as a rescuer, and I take your tagline and I can run it through the ASAP upside down, run it through, and then through a carabiner. There's your belay. I put you onto a 4-to-1. I can get you into that space. All right. Versus a twin tension system, tandem Prusik, or a Munter hitch. If you choose to go with the Munter hitch because you just didn't want to grab the ASAP that was 10 feet away, like, come on. That's not justifiable. You didn't have an ASAP. You didn't have the bag. The rig's not there yet. If we don't go right now, someone's going to die. All right, that might be a situation or a position that you can justify. You just did it because I want to go get it. It's going to be hard to justify that spot. All right. What other equipment are we going to need to extricate them out of that space? And then victim packaging. How are we going to package them up and get them out? Please, let's make sure that we're packaging patients based on what they need versus just what I want to do. Granted, that might influence which one I pick, but make sure that we do it the right way. Then you notice there at the bottom, you do not need all the answers to start working. You can start working with some of the information. You don't need the entire sheet of music before you start playing. And I think sometimes we've gotten into that habit where we want to have everything down to which knot am I going to tie, which carabiner am I going to use. No, like you're going to need a tripod. Get it. Tell the guys start getting it. You're going to need air monitoring. You're going to need ventilation. You're going to need lockout, tagout. You're going to need a permit. You're going to need bags of ropes. You can start pulling that stuff off and you can get working. And here's the nice part is once you get them working, that gives you a second to step back, breathe, and figure out, all right, I'm on steps 1, 2, and 3. What's 4, 5, and 6 look like? All right. Just like you pull up and you see smoke coming out of the house, you don't try to pre-plan everything before you have them pull a line. Everybody starts working, and then you're trying to work ahead of everybody. All right. Phase 3, rescue operations. So following our hierarchy, which one are we going to do? Which one are we going to follow? Phase 4, actually getting the victim up and out of the space. Again, our hierarchy, a Stokes basket is the best thing that we can do for somebody, but it doesn't fit in the space, so we might not be able to use that. So maybe something like a sked, the Petzl nest, spec pack, the hasty harness, or like a handcuff knot, or they make industrial wristlets that you could use to get somebody out of there. Phase 5, rehab. The guys who were in there, depending on what they saw or what they did, how hard they were working, they might need to go relax. Pull out all of our equipment. Before we pull our last person out, let's make sure we do a once over to make sure we don't leave carabiners, meters, whatever else in there. Because if we come out and we close out that permit and we realize we forgot something, we have to open everything back up again to go back in after that one little thing. So let's do that quick walkthrough first, or look around. Debrief. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? What can we do better the next time? Secure everything off. If we're showing up, OSHA is going to be called. OSHA is going to be showing up. So let's set things back to a spot where things are safe. Eventually, they're going to close everything out and they are going to turn it back over to the employer. All right. Thank you guys very much. Let me check I did forget a question. So at what depth does OSHA specify the use of a mechanical advantage system? So if we're going into a pit, how deep, what's the trigger height where OSHA says you need to have a mechanical advantage system in order to pull them out? And that number is 5 feet. All right. So 5 feet or deeper when we need to have a mechanical advantage system. We can't just put a bunch of bubbas on the end of the rope and yank somebody out of there. All right. So I really appreciate you guys listening to me drone on for the last hour or so. If you guys have any questions, please reach out. I really, really hope that in June we're able to get together and train because this is getting kind of old. So any questions, please reach out. Fill out the study guide. That's about it. Thank you much, guys. Have a great night.